Why would Final Fantasy stop? I don't think it's from a lack of money or it's from a lack of popularity. I really think it's from a lack of passion on the creators. Making a new system like Final Fantasy 15 is a lot of coding. It's very boring. And if the fans don't like it, I can understand why you wouldn't want to do it again. But I think the problem is a misdirection of ideas. A lot of the emphasis of Final Fantasy, for some reason, has been to make a world where you can make a sequel, where you can build expansion packs, where you can create a story that, might keep going for some reason. It's like you're trying to make a marketable game instead of a good game. I really think if you went back to basics, some of the passion might be revived. You make just a plain old dungeon with a big boss at the end. It's very complicated to move through, hard to navigate, there's some mini-games in there. I think maybe the fun will come back. Then maybe the problems will seep away. Then maybe in that climate you'll think of yet another wonderful story. We'll have a new Final Fantasy VII, and everyone who's talking about how great Final Fantasy VII was will finally shut up. I don't know. Hell, I would love to see that day. Final Fantasy 12 and 13 really show this idea that stories have to be insanely overcomplicated for them to be good. Don't get me wrong. The good games had very complicated stories. I mean, when you sit down and think about Final Fantasy 8 or Final Fantasy 10 or Final Fantasy 7, they're told using very difficult literary techniques. They got flashback, they got foreshadowing, different time streams. They go forward and back in time. Narrators split.
The main character always turns out to be something he isn't.
It's difficult. But I think Final Fantasy 15 should be basically a quest. The story has to be simple in conception. I'm not talking about Save the Princess. That's what's been done since the beginning of video games. It's been done to death. Maybe something like what I think Final Fantasy 1 should have been. The king sends you out on some kind of quest to defeat somebody. The king tells you he has to destroy a dark wizard. Don't name the dark wizard Garland. If you're so desperate, you can take the name from Tolkien, call him Chrysophilax. But this quest pretty much takes up the whole game, because as you're trying to do the quest, things happen to you.
Maybe by defeating this guy, you can restore the true kingdom. Of course, he has followers, puppet kingdoms, sorcerers. Maybe in the early stages of the game, you have to prove your worth to the king. Maybe as a young knight, you have to prove your own worth to yourself. Start from a base that's very simple, that you can build on, and that can explode into something good. The towns are slave to this guy's will. You'll get to walk through these towns like this age of uncertainty. You'll have to convince towns to follow you to restore the true king. You can even have some political intrigue with this.
Your party meets another king. You might find out that the king is evil and you want to help the guy, but then it turns out he's not. Plot twist like that. You meet more characters. His henchmen thwart you, and you got to work back to get into position to fight him again. Characters might have doubts about the mission. Characters might have interpersonal relationships. Characters in the party will have to bond. Then you'll have a story. You can create epics using very simple techniques. Think of Beowulf. One of the things that made Final Fantasy X great was the simplicity of it. Yuna has to defeat Sin. That's the whole game. Cloud has to defeat Sephiroth. That's the whole game. I think it worked I think it didn't work as well when you didn't know the ultimate aim of the game at first, and it kind of coalesced by halfway in the game. The worst example of this is Final Fantasy VIII, where you kind of learn who the main villain is in disc, 3, instead of disc 1. Which, I think, had there just been like 1 or 2 rewrites, that could have been fixed like this. But I'll get to that when I do Final Fantasy VIII. Kitase is probably the guy who introduced the notion that characters had to be human. Final Fantasy was already moving towards this with Final Fantasy VII. I think it was perfectly realized in Final Fantasy VIII. But it hasn't been there in the rest of the games. It was almost there in Final Fantasy X. It was completely gone in Final Fantasy XII. It wasn't really there in Final Fantasy IX. And no emo, guys. We don't need another Pain. Pain was not a character. Okay? Pain was somebody who's just... like, I don't know. The plot can be simple. It's just that the characters have to undergo them. You can have a character who is a classic hero, But he might have to, in the course of his heroship, he might have to encounter some sort of wimp. And the wimp has to grow stronger because of the hero. That's an idea.
I can't create a story off the top of my head right now, and I can't really describe an entire Final Fantasy game in a YouTube video. But I can give some guidelines. Most importantly, this time around, I want to feel like I'm playing a Final Fantasy game. With these new games, I haven't had that feeling in years. I guess I have to identify what I think makes a Final Fantasy game.
In this series, I'm going to identify some of those intangible things that Katazi talks about that makes a Final Fantasy game. We've already seen some of them, although very few of them, like the Epic Twist and Bahamut. Final Fantasy II had some too. It has a plot, even though it sucks. It has a couple of the enemies, like Marlboros and bombs. It's got essentially the battle system, some of the weapon names. It's got Mithril. And it's got Airship. And it's got Cid. These things have to be in a new Final Fantasy game, this is to be sure. There's also something that I call the illusion of choice, where even though the games are very linear, it feels like you can make choices. The best example of this I can think of is in Final Fantasy VII when you're going up the Shinra building. You have to get up there, but you can either take the stairs or you can go up the elevator. Two very different things. Two very different outcomes in the plot. And, you know, it makes it feel fun. Another good example, which I always liked, is pretty much one of the few things I actually liked about Final Fantasy IX was the fact that you can change your party a lot. You change who is the leader of the character a lot. You can walk around as Garnet, you can walk around as Vivi, you can walk around as Zidane. They might have did a little too much, but I do like that. It makes it feel like you can do more than you actually are. And the best example is probably Final Fantasy VI, where you have to complete all the quests of the three parties, but you can choose the order. There's a lot of other little things that I can't talk about in this video. And the illusion of choice is so important, because what makes Final Fantasy different from other RPGs is the fact that you're driven by a story. There are other RPGs out there like Oblivion, which I like, but they're in this class of RPGs where it's more freeform. And I prefer driven games to freeform games. It's fun exploring, but I want a reason. Me, I don't like wandering everywhere, just aimlessly, and then hopefully I'll find something good. That's not what Final Fantasy is. Final Fantasy XIII was a beautiful game to look at. But I thought that aesthetically, Final Fantasy IX looked better. And Final Fantasy VIII has probably the best graphics a Final Fantasy game can have. I love the way the battles look, how the magic spells were animated, the character animations, the fact that the characters followed you around, even the way the menu was designed. It was just gray, it was simple. You don't have to overstress yourselves to make a hugely complicated, beautiful, pretty, full of transparencies, very hard to manipulate battle system. Ideally, I'd want Uematsu back, but I understand it's pretty difficult, especially after his heavy metal band, the Black Mages, is gone, which is Also, I wish that Final Fantasy had more than like one or two battle themes. I loved in Final Fantasy Tactics that pretty much every single fight had a different theme. I think it would break the monotony. Even if you became so lazy and just put the best battle themes, all the old music, and just shoved it into Final Fantasy 15, it would be better than probably the new stuff you'd write. But I don't want that overly cinematic music where the music just blends and you can't tell the difference. The music helps a lot to convey that you're in like different fantastic places. I'll give you a few examples. Final Fantasy IV is the first game where you actually notice this. Even though the towns look kind of similar, when you walk into a place like Fabul, you know you're in this new place. Then you go to Mysidia. And then you go into the land of dwarves. Final Fantasy IX did this well too. You go from Dali. still Gaza. And don't feel yourselves obligated to have some sort of pop song at the end. You had it best in Final Fantasy VII when it was one song, it was a final boss song, came out of nowhere, and was awesome. Eyes on Me worked because it was in the story. Melodies of Life had nothing to do with anything. Shiteki Dane, wonderful song that applied to the story. Kiss Me Goodbye, who cares? Real Emotion, fuck you. You want a good song? Make the game, then write the song. I always thought the ideal Final Fantasy would be a mixture of a lot of the games. Now the choice is up to you. You can either have a job system, a materia system, or the Chrono Trigger system. Or maybe even a combination of all three, which I think would be better. Chrono Trigger was cool. You can line up the enemies and hit them, and you also had these techs, which I think should have been in every Final Fantasy game. You had dual techs, where two characters would combine and make an attack, and tri-techs, where all three would do that. But another failing of the Final Fantasy games is that sometimes they give you so much magic and so many weapons and so many options in battling, but you never needed them. I want a Final Fantasy game where there's a huge variety of monsters. Get out the bestiary, get the entire list of monsters, and put them all in there. And I want some of these battles to be hard. Really hard. Something where you need a lot of strategy. There's gotta be some way where you can make the battles less boring. Final Fantasy XIII had essentially the most boring battle system ever. It really helps when you have to press buttons to complete attacks. Something like Legend of Dragoon. Even the trigger. Even the trigger in Final Fantasy VIII was kind of fun. You have to press like R1 at the exact right time. If you're gonna have the limit breaks, I want them the way they were in Final Fantasy X. That was pretty much perfect. I want the ability to refine items. That was perfect, and you never did it again. I want the ability to build weapons like you could in Final Fantasy IX. That was a good idea. And I want a simple level up system. As much automation as possible in the level up system. Now let me tell you what I mean. I like the sphere grid. It's a good idea. The problem with the sphere grid is that you have to spend your time going, ooh, select the sphere, put it in. Move, select the sphere, put it in. Move, select the sphere, put it in. 30 times. Switch to the next guy. Move, select the sphere, put it in. If you had something like an autofill, nobody, no one would have complained about the sphere grid. You make up something convoluted like that,
You'd better have some sort of automation feature.
but I don't want you to stop at level 99 or level 100. If you don't know, programmers didn't have a lot of space on old games. So characters level up to level 99 only because there wasn't enough space for the computer program to understand a number like 256 or like a 100. Because hexadecimally it stops. You're beyond that. I want to be able to get to like level 730. That'd be kind of cool. And I want the enemies to level up with you like they did in Final Fantasy VIII. I think that's pretty much one of the best ideas Squaresoft ever came up with. I want some originality with the enemies. I'll take color swaps, but I don't like color swaps. I want, like, if I'm fighting a dragon, I want a huge, evil freaking dragon. Immense thing. I don't want what you had in Final Fantasy IX. Shitty-fied monsters,
Remember, the final boss has to be insane. 54 stages, hundreds of parts. Do Bizarro Sephiroth right. And there's also got to be recurring bosses, at least 5 of them. I loved fighting the Turks. I loved fighting Cypher. Beatrix and Seymour wasn't that good. I want weapons in there. I want optional huge boss fights, but I don't want the final boss fight to be a joke, if you do fight those weapons. And remember, when you make the enemies level up with you, if you want the game to get harder, you can make it harder. You want an insanely hard Final Fantasy game, you can level up to level 970, and you'll get a freaking hard Final Fantasy game.